I am here at the National D-Day Memorial in our Education Quonset hut with our display cases behind me. April is at a secure location,
That's right.
secret bunker somewhere.
Secure vacation location.
Exactly. So, Christine, feel free to jump in. I'll remain incognito. Excellent. Well, we appreciate you joining us.
Yeah,
Talk about D-Day girls. And start out, Christine, if you can let us know, have you read the book? Have you read part of it? Are you, there's a poll question coming up. And some of it, okay, excellent. Now I will make a confession. I read this months ago, back over Christmas vacation, really, is when I read the D-Day Girls. And so I might be a little more rusty on some of the details than you are, but I think it's a great book to discuss for our purposes. So April, what do you think?
Yeah, I do. I think actually I had to reread parts of it because it's been a few months for me as well, but I enjoyed reading it again. Actually, I kind of went through it very quickly. I've read a lot of books on women spies in World War II. And, I think Sarah Rose does a really good job of telling some very specific stories. I know a lot of reviews on her book have been kind of a mix, really. And John, I don't know how you feel, but I think I do think that if you have to follow the book very closely. I think that it's. I think my only criticism, and I do like how she brings out the stories of these women. I think there are stories that we haven't heard as much about some of these women, like Lise de Béziac and Audrey Burrell. I don't think we've heard a lot about them. Odette Sampson is one that we've heard more about, but I do think at times she intersperses their code names with their real names, and I think that can get a little confusing. So I do see from the others' criticism of the book, it could be a little difficult to follow sometimes. I don't know if you felt like that.
I did, and there's the handy chart in the front of the main characters,
Yes.
And I found that useful to keep switching back because everyone had 2 or 3 different names.
I did.
But I agree, and again, I read it sort of casually over Christmas break. Pick it up, read a few pages, put it down, come back an hour later. And I did, it was a little hard to keep some of the characters straight. And then the past week, I've been reviewing it, just kind of flipping through and double checking and straightened up, in my mind a little bit. But you're absolutely right. It is, it's a lot to keep straight, but that's inevitable, I think. And really, the situation with the French underground and the female spies was much more complicated than this when you get down to it. And and Christine agrees with us. Yeah, she felt the same.
Yeah, I do think that, and I think it's good that she only chose a couple of the women to follow as closely as she did, because I think at times it was hard to keep track of who she was following, even though I love the stories and I've heard them before, so it wasn't, I kind of could pick up where she was, but at other times, she was in different places at different times, and it at times lacked some cohesion that was difficult, but I don't think it necessarily got in the way of the story. I think in some ways it mimicked, like you said, John, at times the French underground was certainly disorganized at many points. It was hard. It was a very difficult organization to find cohesion, and you had to have these organizers come in and try their best to organize these different, basically guerrilla organizations and have them fight together. And I love, that in a lot of ways she shed some light on that. You had your organizer, you had your radio operator, you had your couriers. And I think in our history, this is coming to light now that many of those radio operators and couriers were women. And I think in years past, we haven't seen that story. And, 42%, I think, of couriers were killed during World War II doing this work. So it was a very dangerous job. And to see Odette in that role, for example, just gave some sense of, what this was like and how they lived in such peril all the time. I mean, they were constantly moving. And I think that goes to the fact that why women were chosen in many ways for those roles, because they could get around much easier than men. To be a courier or to be a radio operator, you had to be traveling all the time. Women were able to do that a little bit easier than men. Otherwise, you came under suspicion. So I think it goes to show why women were sought after for some of these roles.
And that is an interesting point. I picked up reading it that what are some of the qualities that made you ideal for this role in the French underground as a woman? And were there some particular feminine traits at that time that were more desirable than some of the male traits? Because I read, some of the male characters in there, and I think, if they were in this situation where they're being confronted, and one of the women, they're being confronted by a checkpoint, and she just kind of walks the way through it, whereas one of the men might have become much more combative. But what do you think were some of the qualities? And Christine, feel free to chime in as well. What are some of the qualities that make a good woman spy in World War II?
Yeah, I mean, that's, well, I think with any spy, you had to exert an extraordinary amount of courage and patriotism, because otherwise I don't know how you would do what they were tasked to do. I mean, you had to know going into this that you were probably going to die. I mean, I don't, your chances, they certainly didn't hold back what your chances were of survival. So I think you had to be very upfront, willing to do that, willing to give your all for your country. And so I think you see an extraordinary amount of patriotism among all of those spies, all of those who were part of the SOE. I think women also, though, had the ability to, they had a lot of natural networks. I think the ability to form some of those natural networks just by who they were. I think you see that with Liz de Béziac and her role, and how she's kind of uses her status in society a bit to do what she did, and yet not really come under suspicion for quite some time. So I think that was very interesting to see. And women did certainly love very passionately too. I mean, they had a love for their country, but also they had a loyalty to those that they served with. And you didn't see these women very often give up the names of those they served with. And I think that's shown through Odette. I mean, the amount of courage and what she went through when she was interrogated 14 times as they ripped out all of her toenails, and the things that they did to her, and she still never released any information. And part of that was her love for Peter, but mostly it was her love for her country. It's just extraordinary example of that determination. I think you had have a lot of characteristics, but certainly courage was first and foremost in your patriotism.
I agree, and I think early in the book, in the recruitment process, their disdain for the Nazi occupation was obviously necessary, and who can blame them? We just had our kids' camp, which of course was not in person; it was a camp in a box, and one of the themes was spy camp. And we talked about this on a kid's level. What does it take to be a successful spy? And of course, language ability. The fact that people could get by in French, assume an identity. I couldn't do that. But they spoke French as natives, and noticed that many of the men that show up didn't. That was mentioned several times. It's their language. They didn't quite pronounce things right. One of them had to have a cover that he was he was studied in Canada, and it just threw off his pronunciation of things.
That's right.
And the
So
other one,
no, go ahead.
I was saying the other one that hit me was some degree of flexibility. You couldn't follow a prescribed flow chart. Do this, then do this, and then do this. You had to really think on your feet, and these women really could. They did an exemplary job of it, and right up to the time when some of them are arrested. Spoiler alert, Christine, if you haven't.
Yes, that's well, and you had to have, I think someone described it as a lonely and cool courage. That certainly for some of these agents, they were going to be very alone at times. They were going to, you couldn't really, you couldn't trust anyone really on most levels. You had to be cautious of everyone. And as you saw in the book, there were those that you really thought would not betray them who did betray them. Or situations where just typical civilians who, because they were starving and sold out those that they knew might have been spies and things like that. I mean, you just couldn't trust anyone. So that had to be an incredibly lonely and terrifying experience to be in France all of those years, all of that time, and just know that really at the heart of it, you could only trust yourself. So yes, I mean, and one thing I'd be interested with Christine with some of the book that she's read, and maybe she can let us know. But John, I'd be interested too with you. Who was your favorite spy in the book?
I have a favorite. I think it almost varies from situation to situation. I mean,
yeah.
In the training, Odette, I think, was the one that was almost disdainful of some of the training and just, let me get over there and get started. But then, let's say the courage they show when they're in tight spots, and in some cases, Christine also intrigued by Odette, and good reason.
Yeah. I love Odette. She's my favorite. I think all of them have an extraordinary story. But I think, again, just what she went through and what she was able to accomplish in her time. And even toward the end when she was released, and how she had the knowledge and the forethought to sit in that car, again, spoiler alert, Christine, sorry about that, to make sure that she had collected all that information from the Ravensbrück, the Nazi who was in charge of Ravensbrück, and to make sure that she was able to collect those papers that he had that was in the back of that car and everything, and that way he could be prosecuted and eventually tried and executed for what he did in Ravensbrück. I think was just remarkable. Even though she was on the brink of death, she still had the forethought to do that. And she just, to know that for as much time as she spent in a solitary cell with no light, the courage and the determination to survive, just the will to survive is just an amazing story. So I really did love her details about Odette. I think that was pretty neat. She even tells the story about, and yes, her maturity and her age, I think, had a lot to do with that. I agree, Christine. It was, she just, she seemed wise even beyond her years, and always remained very cool in any situation that she was under. So I just, very, very, just an amazing story. So yeah, she's probably one of my favorites. And the fact that she had 3 children, her girls, because I think, John, we've talked about why would you do that, especially if you're a mother? I think about that myself. Would I have done this knowing I had children and I may never see them again? But I think there's a wonderful, beautiful point in there where she says, how can I not? How could I leave them a world basically that would be led by, this tyrannical regime like Hitler? Can I hand them that world? I can't in good conscience.
The author hints she was not the most maternal of mothers.
Right. Right.
And but I thought the same thing in reading other stories of spies and, different wars as well. The more you have at stake, the more cautious you're going to become. So yeah, if she, like, April has young kids at home, and I think your instinct would be to protect them rather than risk them, by going out on a limb.
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree.
That's true of a lot of cases of espionage or underground activity or whatever, and pick a time in history, the Soviet Union, and you mentioned Turn, and I've not watched the series Turn.
I haven't seen that either. No, I'm gonna have to tune into that. Is it good, Christine? Is it worth watching? We want to know.
And let me also mention, Christine, if you're intrigued by Odette, look up the story of Virginia Hall.
Oh yeah.
And her role during the war. She's mentioned in passing in the book a couple of times,
yeah, such a great story.
She was something.
Amazing story. Yeah, there's a great book called Wolves at the Door, and I can't remember the author right now, oh my goodness, but it's Wolves at the Door, which is absolutely great story about Virginia Hall. And she was, of course, part of the SOE for a short time until her cover was blown, and then ended up wanting to go back to France. The SOE said, there's no way we can send you back to France because your cover is blown. So she goes to the OSS in America, and they send her in. So she goes back to France. An amazing story there as well. And like I said, these women just showed such extraordinary courage to go back time and again. I mean, there's other stories in there that she doesn't go into detail on, but I think it's because we know their stories a little bit more. Violet Zabot was one of them, and of course there's a movie, Carve Her Name with Pride, that was very well known, which Odette Sampson actually helped oversee the making of that movie, because she knew Violet Zabot, and she she knew the details. And of course, Violet was executed by the Nazis during the war for her work as a spy. But there's a lot of little stories in there that are fun to kind of follow up on and read about them. But we know a little bit more about those. So really interesting. So John, I was curious if one of the things that, I mean, there's a lot of questions, but there's some things I wonder if we can draw any similarities to today, but we'll kind of come to that. But first of all, before we do that, I'm curious with Christine and you, what you all thought of the title of the book. Did she choose the right title? What do you think?
Oh, I think for marketing purposes, yes, because D-Day sells. There's a natural fascination with D-Day. If you're interested in World War II history, D-Day is obviously one of the bigger topics.
Yeah.
So yeah, from a marketing standpoint, absolutely. But D-Day itself really isn't that much of the narrative. It's more of the preparation for D-Day.
Yeah.
And it would take me a while to find it in the page, but there's one section where it's talking about the SOE priorities begin to shift as they get closer to the invasion, from just let's harass the Germans, let's blow up a power pylon there and cut a railroad line here, and then it becomes much more focused on what can the underground do to support the invasion itself, as opposed to just make it hard for the Germans to fight the war. It became more of a tactical kind of tool than a strategic. And I say then you actually get to D-Day, and it's it's not anticlimactic because obviously it's a big part of the story, but D-Day itself just takes up relatively small amount, as it should, because she's not telling the story of D-Day per se.
Yeah.
It's the story of these women, and these 3 or 4 women in particular, and their role.
Yeah, I think Sarah Rose even points out, because Christine, I think, pointed out that some of her friends were offended, I think, by the title or by the use of the term girls. And certainly, I guess, I can see that. Sarah Rose defends it by saying that that was the term that was certainly used in a lot of the written communication at the time. And so she's simply just attributing it to that, which, you know, and I think on that level, yes, it's uncomfortable maybe today that we see that. But then again, you know, would the women of D-Day sell as many books as D-Day girls? You know? So from a marketing standpoint, she probably chose well. I mean, I think it's not so bad. And there have been a string of books recently named very similar. I think there's things like, what was it? The Radium Girls and
Radium Girl, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a couple of, you know, so there's a couple others I think that are somewhat similar, and she may be just kind of going off of that trend a little bit.
You mentioned it somewhere, and I can't remember if it's in one of the note or in an epilogue or an afterward.
Yeah.
That the term "girl" was, you know, much less offensive in World War II than some people might find it today, which is absolutely true.
I think you're right. You know, again, I think it's, I wasn't really offended by it. I think it's, again, just something that we may not be less inclined to use that today, but it was certainly, she said something that they use pretty frequently then. So, so very interesting.
Before Christine came on, we were talking about the cover too. So curious, Christine, do you like the cover? The art in particular?
Yeah, and I think it's pretty neat. There's some people who criticize the cover as well, saying that it's just kind of comic looking, which I don't agree with that. Or that, you know, it's not accurate, which again, yeah, and the illustrator probably knew that. I mean, you know, I think it gets your attention. I think, you know, most people would say, well, she's not going to be bicycling down the street with her gun thrown over her shoulder. That would certainly give her away as a spy. Well, yes, that's correct. But I don't think that's necessarily the intent. It's to get your attention and say, oh, well, you know, she's doing something important for the war effort here. That makes me want to pick it up and read it. So I don't find that offensive at all. I think, I don't think it's so much about being accurate as it is about getting your attention.
I hadn't really paid attention.
Yeah.
To the cover.
But
because
it's certainly received some criticism for that, but you know, again, I don't think it's that bad. I do think it brings up an important point though, is that so many of those couriers, you know, they use their bikes. I mean, this is how they got around, and they would travel, you know, up to sometimes 100 miles just on bicycle just to get these messages passed and going through numerous checkpoints. I mean, it's incredibly dangerous work that they did. Their bicycle was what got them there. And so just, you know, we read about many of the women who used that as their means from point A to point B, how many checkpoints they went through. So yeah, just so I think it's a great symbol, I think, again, of what these couriers had to do day in and day out.
Was it Odette who got over to France and finally revealed she didn't know how to ride a bike?
Yes, I believe it was Odette, and she, fell off the bicycle almost immediately, but she didn't want to admit it to Peter. I think Peter, that she didn't know how to ride a bicycle. And yes, I thought that was a great story. But eventually, she picked it up very quickly and was riding everywhere. So yeah, that's pretty great. She was tough. She wasn't going to admit when she didn't know how to do something. She was going to learn how to do it, which I love. I think the other endearing story about Odette is that when she was in prison and she was, you know, really near death's door, and how she survived. I loved how the author gets into her mind of how, as she lay there in the dark day after day after day, nearly starved to death, and she would think of things like houses and how she would decorate them, or you know, foods, and just things in her mind that would occupy her time. And she had learned to do that as a child, because she had because of a severe illness as a child, she was blind for 3.5 years. and also had polio as a child as well. So she lived to learned how to live with that during that time, of how to kind of be inward, look into yourself and get through those difficult times in a way that I think the ordinary person wouldn't have been able to do. And I think that's why she survived that kind of solitary confinement as well. So just interesting. Again, another thing about Odette that I thought was a great story about her survival.
And that's something that's always interested me, not just with this, but books say about POWs in the Pacific, and I've read quite a few of those.
Yeah.
And the mental strength that you had to have to survive this kind of endurance.
Yes.
And as you read it, you have to ask, could I do that? I'm not sure I could.
Right.
I am too easily bored, and the thought of just being in solitary confinement, with nothing to do but your own thoughts, would just be torturous to me. So I admire those who endured those kind of experiences, and the mental strength that it took to do it. As I say, I'm not. I think I would break pretty quickly. So.
Yes. No, I agree. I think it would be very, very, very difficult. And and there's again, there's a lot of encouraging stories in there too. I think we haven't talked a lot about Yvonne Roudelet. I mean, she was fascinating too. So I think she was older as well. She was an older agent who went in and eventually was shot in the head and ended up in the hospital. And I loved how and those little acts of resistance. We talk about these huge acts of resistance where you're blatantly going out as a courier or a wireless operator, but I think we sometimes forget about just the little everyday acts of resistance. And I know the people at the hospital there were, if Nazi officers were coming to interrogate her, they would ring an alarm in her room, and doctor would quickly give her a shot to put her to sleep, so that they wouldn't interrogate her. Little things like that, I think, were just great everyday acts of humanity and heroism that you would see throughout France. And so, whether it was providing food to downed airmen or to maybe a spy along their way somewhere else. I mean, those were extraordinary acts of courage, because even if you were caught doing simple little things like that, your life could end. So
there's one that hit me when Peter Churchill is arrested and he's being interrogated, and his cover story was some sort of government official that required him to go from town to town, and so the interrogators called the mayor in and said, "This man says he's a government official. Do you know him?" He says, "Well, yes, I've seen him around many times. I don't know him well, but yeah, he's traveled through quite often." And then Sarah Rose mentions in passing they never met. And here's the mayor, just kind of instinctively saying, "Oh yes, I'm going to help this guy with his cover story."
Which is fantastic. I mean, I just love those little examples, because I think there are plenty of people who felt like they couldn't do much, but perhaps they could do something. And
I think that explains a lot. And she mentions that, toward the end as well, that, after the war, everyone in France was in the resistance. And I suspect if we really could, really dig into that question, what we find out is a lot of people, very few people were actually in the active resistance that this is described in the book. But, how many people had the opportunity to just misdirect a German patrol and say, "Oh yes, go down this road," and they should have gone down the other one, or to, slip some food to a refugee when they shouldn't have done it. And I think that those little acts were probably the majority of the resistance, in terms of, numbers of episodes, and where a lot of French people, at least they could say, I couldn't have a radio set in my basement and house pilot who had bailed out, but I could certainly do my little part when the occasion arose.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think it's hard then to really pinpoint what percentage of the population was really resistance. I mean, I think if you're looking at outright resistance members, the percentage was very small, but it's those everyday acts of resistance also that helped ultimately gather this intelligence for D-Day, that helped ultimately win the war in so many ways. I mean, they were small, but it was still important. I mean, it was not, as I think as Eisenhower said, it was because there's a lot of debate on whether or not the French resistance really made a difference. But I think it made a difference in a lot of ways, and I think if for nothing else, it boosted morale of those French who, whether or not they were doing anything actively to help, knew that potentially their country would be liberated. It was inspiring to know that there were people out there working to change this. I mean, and I think she uses a word, where was it? Dépaysement, which I guess was meaning that this sense that you were not at home, even though you were home. You were in France, but it didn't feel like France. That everywhere you looked, there was swastikas and German troops, and they controlled everything. So you didn't really feel at home. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to know truly at the end of the day what percentage of people were part of the resistance in any way, shape, or form. But I think every small act contributed to the whole, and that's important because they wanted I think for the most part, people wanted their country back. They wanted the old France back, whether they collaborated or not.
Yeah, I think if we again could reconstruct all of the history, we would find out some of the ones who were accused and often punished for collaboration were really resisting in their own way.
Yeah.
You are, maybe girlfriend of a German soldier. You're at the end of the war. They grab you. They shave your head. You're, branded collaborator, and but that collaborator may well have been feeding information, or gathering information, or doing what they could. So, I don't think this is a great contribution to the history, but I don't think the full history is ever going to be told, because by definition it was all secret. I mean, you couldn't know it in minutes.
Yeah, and I think
although apparently too many of them are writing things down, apparently.
That's right. Well, if you're a good agent, you don't leave anything behind, right? So there shouldn't be a whole lot left behind. But you're right. I mean, and I think the other thing that's important too, and Sarah Rose probably doesn't necessarily. She may overstate the fact that this. I don't know that she says it outright, but this is not the first time women have done this. I mean, World War II is not the first time women have been spies or been involved in intelligence or espionage. I mean, it happened in World War I. It's happened in other wars prior to that. I mean, there have always been women involved in a very patriotic way to try to help. The intelligence agents in Britain was established in 1909. So there were women in World War I who were certainly active in gathering intelligence for the war, and who risked their lives, and some were executed when they were captured. So
Civil War, Revolutionary War.
Yeah, exactly.
We had the records, the Peloponnesian War.
Right. Yeah. So it's not new, and I think in some ways her book seems to make it sound like something that's very new in terms of women, but it's certainly not. It's you may have seen more of an organized attempt to place women in the field in this way during World War II, but it certainly wasn't something that was new necessarily. So
right.
Yeah.
One thing that interests me is that the French underground, again, it didn't win the war by itself. It contributed to victory. It's going to take a lot of infantrymen and armor and artillery to win the war. But they did their part, and left behind at least some history. I am not aware of anything the Germans did equivalent in Britain. Every German agent I've ever heard of in Britain is turned by the British and feeding false information, or imprisoned and just taken out of the game. But the Germans almost, they seem almost disdainful of that kind of intelligence gathering. She talks about the radio game in here. And again, Christine, I don't know how far you've gotten in the book where this comes up, but where they capture some of the resistance radios, and they're using it to try to feed false information or arrange, drops of equipment, and and continuing on as sort of false resistance agents. But are you aware of anything in Britain or the United States roughly close to what the Allies are able to pull off here? I think the Japanese are even better at it than the Germans, at least in the Pacific or in.
Right. You mean in terms of the spy network?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I think Britain certainly perfected it in a lot of ways. I think, that's a great question. I don't know in Germany. I think you're right. I believe there was probably more disbelief and a distrust of information that you would get in that way. And I think there are plenty of times in World War II where they would get information from a spy network that they had in place, but they didn't necessarily always believe it, which I've always thought was interesting. Yeah. And because they thought they would have the information in their hands, and they would, including D-Day, there's plenty of information that they had, but they chose not to believe it. And so that's always been fascinating to me, why they didn't believe
and share it within their, Nazi Germany had 15 different intelligence operations, and they didn't talk to them.
Yeah, which is very interesting.
There was no reason they should not have known D-Day was coming to Normandy in early June 1944, and it completely caught them by surprise.
Yeah, but so much of that.
She mentions this, that they had captured enough French underground personnel and code books and radio sets. They knew all these codes that are being broadcast. John has a long mustache, and all these that indicate the invasion is on the horizon. And yet Rundstedt looks at it and says, Eisenhower's not going to announce the invasion on BBC. It's and
and then they,
if the Nazis could have gotten out of their own way, it would have been war.
Exactly. And yet, there's some good examples in the book of where the British did some similar things. Buckmaster ignoring the fact, I forgot which agent it was now, Marsac maybe, who, when he was first captured, left off one of his identifying codes, which he was, you're always supposed to have. And there was someone in the SOE who even said, I think he's been compromised because he doesn't have his second identifying code on here. And they kind of ignored it and just said they kept accepting all of these messages that were coming from him, and then sending more and more agents out into the field who were immediately captured because of that. So it's always interesting to me, like you said, why on both sides did they choose not to believe some intelligence or some signs rather than others? I don't know. And maybe it's because intelligence was not as respected in some ways. It wasn't military. I know with when the Americans were setting up their the OSS, there's a lot of pushback because the military said basically, that's just getting in the way of the military. That's not legitimate warfare. And so I think you might have had that in other
Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare.
Ungentlemanly warfare, that's right. Churchill wanted to set Europe ablaze, right, with confusion and chaos and everything, because this was total war. Things had changed, and certainly he wanted to.
Diplomats as well. I think they were guilty of this because in diplomacy, there's a certain politeness that you follow in intelligences. So I think it was in World War I. I'm trying to think which diplomat said it, but kind of sniffed that gentlemen do not read each other's mail.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, you're right.
The enemy was reading his mails.
Yeah. Well, and I think So I think something very similar in referring to the women who went in, I think the reason why we're just now seeing some of the women's stories come to light too is because I think that was considered at the time, even though women had done this and they had done it for very long time, particularly when you have people like de Gaulle who tried to, in a sense, I think it was offensive to some that women were placed in that role to begin with, or that they had to be placed and put in that position. And so I think when the war was over, you kind of saw that wiped away. Women certainly didn't talk about it. All these women, like most agents, they didn't talk about it after the war. They didn't talk about what they did if they survived. But certainly, I think the role of women was certainly downplayed, because I don't think it was something that Britain was very proud of, or France, for that matter. Certainly, like I said, de Gaulle certainly took a very paternalistic approach, and that was something that they certainly wouldn't be proud of, to know that women were placed in that position, or that they actually succeeded in some of what they did as well. I think a lot of it's been written about these women earlier on, kind of didn't really focus so much on their achievements, but the fact that they had the best intentions. They were very patriotic, but I think now we see that they really did achieve a lot. There's a lot that was done in gathering intelligence for D-Day, for example. I think that was the most important part, not just the blowing up of bridges and supply chains, but just gathering information. Was so key to the Allies when they landed, to be able to have the information on hand when they were there. Was very, very critical. So I know, there were quite a few agents who that's really what they focused on, was collecting that intelligence. So yeah, pretty fascinating on how it was certainly downplayed over after the war.
And I think the stories are only now being told because one, the files are declassified. So
yes.
I think they writer like Sarah Rose to be the first one to go through those boxes somewhere in the archive. But also, what you said a minute ago, the women didn't talk about it because often they couldn't. And we had Dorothy, a code girl here a couple of years ago, who was an American crypt analyst for the American, for not the Pentagon then, but for the military.
Right.
Breaking codes, and she went 65, 70 years without ever saying anything about it because she was told she couldn't.
Yeah.
And and it was only when her son, who was an attorney, said that she was no longer under her secrecy oath, that she could speak about it, that she actually kind of came out of the closet as one of the code girls.
Yeah, that's right. I know, that's so amazing that they really were still committed to that kind of code of secrecy, to just never disclose what they did. And it's fascinating. But I'm really glad some of the records are declassified now, so we can hear some of these stories, because it's nice to have them come to life now.
And it's also allowing the historians to not really be revisionist, but to go back and question some of the assumptions, because right after the war, memoirs are written, oral histories are gathered, and they tend to kind of cement into the historical record, this is the way it was. And now historians are able to go back and say, well, wait a minute, how do we really know this was true? Like the role of the underground in Paris, or the just more casual resistance that's always been sort of discounted. But now historians are able to come back and kind of say, let's revisit this that we've just accepted for 75 years and see if it's really true.
I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, the historian Max Hastings calls it, there's that quote about romantic twaddle that Sarah Rose certainly took exception with.
Uh-huh. Yeah, let me find the quote.
I think it's so, I thought that was very interesting. And she obviously got fired up about that. And I can certainly see why.
The war historian Max Hastings says what gets published about the female agents of SOE is romantic twaddle. Yeah, and I looked for the book she references, and I couldn't find a copy to see kind of the context of what Hastings was talking about, because I've read several of Hastings' books, and you know, he's a respectable historian.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think Hastings is an excellent historian, and I think he focuses on the facts. You know, I think he's very straightforward with these are the facts. And I think you've got a book like this, which I happen to like books like this too, because they are very much the social fabric, the social history that dives into more of the lives of these individuals. You know, you're getting to know them in a very personal, intimate way, and I think that's important, and I think that's why Sarah Rose took exception to it. It's not, I mean, I guess the question is, in Max Hastings' mind, is, you know, are we romanticizing the war in a sense? You know, by, you know, is that just more, you know, is that a fair view of World War II to kind of do that? I don't think she's doing that. I think she's just telling these stories that haven't been told, and whether or not one agrees if the French resistance made a huge impact or not, these women still put their lives on the line. Agents still put their lives on the line to make some kind of difference, to fight back, to at least show that they were doing something to push back against this tyranny. And I think that's important for us to know. I think, you know, I just think it's important as the whole tapestry that we look at of World War II. These kinds of stories matter. So I can see why she would have been offended by that. And
well, I agree. Yeah. I think we can get into danger of romanticizing some aspects of the war.
Yes.
It really was, you know, it's the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. We can get down to it.
Right.
And you probably noticed, and Christine, I don't know if you have, in the last 20, 25 years, how many books come out that are exceptional history, but they read like novels, a narrative history, exciting, you know, even, you know, dialogue, and, you know, read like they could easily be made into a movie, and many have, like Unbroken, Flags of Our Fathers, you know, some of these that are written about World War II. And I think we can get into a you know, danger of romanticizing some aspects of the war when that becomes the goal. But at the same time, it's also raising so much awareness of the war, because someone's going to read a you know, a narrative history like this more than just an academic monograph about the role of women in the resistance. So I think it's a good thing overall. But you know, so, and I don't think Sarah Rose does. I have read a few books that I think are a little over romantic.
Right.
I wouldn't call them twaddle necessarily, but they let the storytelling get in the way of the history on occasion.
Sure.
And I don't think Sarah does, but
right. I would agree with that. Yeah, I think there are plenty of times where it can focus on, you know, I think, yeah, speaking of romance, I mean, she very easily could have focused on, for example, the love story between Peter and herself.
And they will when they make the movie.
And they did. They made a movie. But, you know, but that was part of the story. I think you had these agents, you know, who worked so closely together in these intense circumstances, and you never knew if you were going to survive the next day. So I think it was so important to show that these relationships often did, you know, at least sometimes did, turn into something that was more. And they obviously loved each other, and I think she saved his life. I mean, Peter acknowledged how she had certainly saved his life by coming up with that, you know, little fib under interrogation that, you know, Peter Churchill was the nephew of Winston Churchill, and she was married to him. And all that was, yeah, sorry. How great to think on her feet like that.
Yeah, I thought that was amazing. Yeah.
Just wonderful, and it worked because, you know, they They both survived. So yeah, just overall really wonderful. So I think we should ask Christine if she had to rate the book with what she's read so far.
Christine's asking a great question here. Would the outcome have been different if not for these women? And I think the outcome of the Allies winning the war was dependent on a lot of other things than, you know, the espionage, you know, being gathered in France. I've always told students, for instance, if you want to know why we won the war, look at factories in the United States more than any other aspect. But I think certainly, you know, some of the smaller outcomes, you know, how many lives were saved through this? How much German, you know, manpower was devoted to chasing these people down rather than manning the guns in Normandy when we invaded. So, what do you think? How would the outcome have been different if not for Odette and Lizzie and Andre and the rest of them?
Well, you know, I think Eisenhower answered that, and I really loved what he said, because I think he said that had it not been the French resistance, the war would have gone on at least 6 months longer. And I think Eisenhower really understood what was going on. He had his finger obviously on the pulse. He had to, of what was happening and the intelligence he was receiving. And I think that's a fair estimate to me. I mean, for Eisenhower to say that, I think is a very objective look at perhaps the difference that the French resistance made, and particularly in Normandy when they were, you know, sabotaging and blowing supply lines and railroad tracks and everything that they did. It certainly helped the cause. And for Eisenhower to say that it shortened the war by 6 months, I think it's pretty telling. So
it made it much harder for the Germans to respond to the invasion.
That's right. Absolutely. So yeah, I think that was I think that was a good assessment on his part. So how would we rate the book on a scale of 1 to 5 then, with 5 being the best book you've read in a long time and 1 being really terrible? I'll have to
what do you think, Christine?
And would you recommend it to a friend? Okay.
4, I think it's fair. Yeah,
me too. I'd probably give it that, I think.
I don't know that I would go to a 5 just because, like you say, I did get confused by a little bit of it on a quick read.
Yeah.
But that's inevitable. I say you've got to keep so many characters straight and so many different names.
Yes.
It's not the first time I've run across that, you know, when you have a lot of different people.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's a fair, no, a 4 is good. I think there were some issues with cohesion, but other than that, I think it's a great story, and I think people will pick that up and they'll learn a little bit more about the French resistance and the SOE and their efforts, and a little bit, you know, what it took ultimately to help everyone to come together in some fashion to help win the war.
I think when you had Sarah Rose here, she could say she could have had the book, you know, this thick.
Yes, I think she would have said that. A lot of research.
Once you get to the publisher, then there's, you know, you've got to start getting to a target of a page count, and you know,
I would agree.
The editors start saying, "Oh, we got to drop this and drop that," but I suspect, you know, if there were a you know, unredacted version, it'd be 3 of these books.
Mm-hmm.
And no one would read it because
yeah, that's right. And Christine was asking about, yes, Virginia Hall is the name. And the book Wolves at the Door is a really good, quick read about Virginia Hall, which is, she's my favorite American spy. So.
I think the Smithsonian had a podcast on her not too long ago that I listened to.
Yes, they probably did. She was a woman of remarkable determination. Had lost her leg in a hunting accident and was still a spy with a prosthetic wooden leg, and spent quite a bit of time in France gathering, not only organizing circuits within France for the resistance, but helping a lot of downed airmen in the process and things like that. So great story.
Another one, good one to look up sometime, Christine, would be Claire Phillips, whose code name was High Pockets in the Philippines. And she's another one that just came out of nowhere. She was a singer in nightclubs in the Philippines till the Japanese came, and all of a sudden she becomes this master spy who also set up networks to feed starving POWs. And that's another good one if you ever get a chance to look up High Pockets. Did April freeze on us? Okay. Well, I think April's internet has given out, but we're about at the end anyway. So, Christine, we want to thank you for joining in, and yeah, please join in for our other virtual programs that are coming up, and our book club in August, which will be on The First Wave by Alex Kershaw, a good friend of the memorial, and much more D-Day focused, as you'll see. But again, thank you for joining in. I hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of the book as well, because it's a great read.